She wore the heiress's dress and got hired as CEO. Chapter 1. The November rain hammered against the windows of Elena Martinez's cramped studio apartment in Queens, each drop echoing the rhythm of her racing heart as she stared at the crimson silk gown hanging on her closet door. The dress seemed to glow in the dim light of her single lamp, its delicate beading catching what little illumination filtered through her water-stained ceiling. She had exactly 47 minutes to transform herself from a struggling marketing coordinator who ate ramen 5 nights a week into someone who belonged at the Sterling Foundation's annual charity gala at the Plaza Hotel. "You can do this," she whispered to her reflection, though the woman staring back looked far from convinced. Dark circles shadowed her brown eyes, testament to the 3 part-time jobs she juggled alongside her day position at a failing startup. The dress had arrived that morning via courier, a desperate plea from her college roommate Sophia, who worked as a personal stylist for Manhattan's elite. One of her clients, the notoriously reclusive heiress Victoria Sterling, had cancelled at the last minute, leaving Sophia with a dress that needed to be returned to the designer's showroom by morning. But first, Sophia had begged Elena to wear it to the gala and network, knowing her friend's company was folding, and she desperately needed connections. Elena's fingers trembled as she zipped up the dress, the fabric hugging her figure as if it had been tailored specifically for her. She'd spent the last of her savings on a pair of designer shoes from a consignment shop and watched countless YouTube tutorials to perfect the elegant updo that now crowned her head. The transformation was remarkable. Gone was the exhausted woman who had been surviving on 4 hours of sleep and sheer determination. In her place stood someone who looked like she had never worried about rent or wondered if she could afford both groceries and her Metro card. The rain had stopped by the time her Uber pulled up to the plaza, and Eleanor forced herself to walk with the confidence she had observed in the wealthy clients who occasionally visited her startup's offices. The doorman didn't question her. The coat check attendant smiled deferentially, and within moments she was swept into a world of champagne flutes and conversations about quarterly earnings and hostile takeovers. She navigated the room carefully, introducing herself simply as Elena, allowing others to make their own assumptions about who she might be. It was near the elaborate ice sculpture that her life changed forever. Richard Sterling, the patriarch of Sterling Industries, had been watching her for 20 minutes, noting how she engaged with the Japanese investors, switching effortlessly to discussing market trends in Asia, knowledge gleaned from her nights spent reading financial reports to understand why her startup was failing. When she offered a brilliant solution to a supply chain issue that had been plaguing one of Sterling's subsidiaries, speaking with an authority that came from having personally dealt with similar problems on a smaller scale, Richard made his approach. "Victoria," he said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty. "Your mother told me you might come tonight, though I hardly believed it after all these years." Elena's blood froze. But before she could correct him, he continued. "That solution you just proposed, it's exactly the kind of thinking Sterling Industries needs. We've kept your position open, hoping you'd finally take your rightful place. The board meets Monday. Say yes, and you'll be announced as our new CEO." Eleanor stood at the precipice of a moment that would define everything that came after. The real Victoria Sterling, she knew from Sophia's gossip, had been living in Europe for the past decade, refusing all contact with her family's business. Richard Sterling was seeing what he wanted to see, a prodigal heiress finally ready to claim her inheritance. Every fibre of Elena's moral being screamed at her to correct this terrible misunderstanding. But another voice, the one that had kept her fighting through poverty and disappointment, whispered of the opportunities this could bring, not just for her, but for all the innovative ideas she'd never had the power to implement. As Richard Sterling extended his hand, waiting for an answer that would change the trajectory of her entire existence, Eleanor felt the weight of the dress against her skin and made a choice that would transform a borrowed gown into a borrowed life. Chapter 2. Monday arrived with the brutal efficiency of a New York minute, and Elena found herself standing before the towering glass monument of Sterling Industries on Madison Avenue, her reflection in the polished doors showing a woman she barely recognized. She had spent the weekend in a frantic preparation, researching everything about Victoria Sterling through whatever scarce information existed online, studying Sterling Industries' financial reports until her eyes burned, and practicing the kind of detached confidence she imagined an heiress would possess. Sophia, unknowingly complicit, had mentioned that Victoria's personal assistant had been reaching out, saying the family wanted to reconnect, which gave Elena the perfect excuse for why Victoria would suddenly appear after years of absence. The executive elevator whisked her to the 40th floor, where Richard Sterling's assistant, Margaret Chen, a sharp-eyed woman in her 50s, greeted her with a mixture of curiosity and skepticism. "Miss Sterling, your office has been maintained exactly as specified in your trust requirements," she said, leading Eleanor down a hallway lined with original Rothkos and Pollocks. Eleanor nodded with what she hoped was appropriate indifference, though her heart threatened to burst from her chest when Margaret opened the massive oak doors to reveal a corner office that was larger than her entire apartment building's footprint. The board meeting was scheduled for 2 o'clock, giving Eleanor just enough time to review the strategic materials Margaret had prepared. As she studied the documents, she discovered that Sterling Industries was hemorrhaging money in 3 key divisions, problems that eerily mirrored what she had witnessed at her startup, but on a scale that involved hundreds of millions rather than thousands. Her mind, sharpened by years of making impossible budgets work and finding creative solutions with no resources, immediately began identifying inefficiencies and opportunities that the previous leadership had missed. When she entered the boardroom, 12 pairs of eyes turned to assess her, each board member representing different factions and interests within the company. Richard Sterling made the introduction with paternal pride that made Elena's stomach twist with guilt. "Ladies and gentlemen, my niece Victoria has finally come home to take her rightful place. She spent the last decade studying our competitors in European markets, and I believe she's exactly what Sterling Industries needs to navigate these turbulent times." Elena stood, her hands steady despite the magnitude of her deception, and began presenting her vision for the company. She spoke about digital transformation, about leveraging emerging markets, about sustainability not as a cost, but as a competitive advantage. These weren't the theoretical musings of a business school graduate, but hard-won insights from someone who had watched companies die from their inability to adapt. When board member Harrison Wade challenged her on the feasibility of her proposed restructuring, she responded with detailed implementation plans she had developed while surviving in the corporate trenches, watching executives make the same mistakes that had doomed her startup. The meeting stretched for 3 hours, and by the end, even the skeptics were leaning forward, engaged by her proposals. Thomas Hartley, the CFO, pulled up financial projections on his tablet, running numbers based on her suggestions, his expression shifting from doubt to intrigue as the calculations showed potential savings of $200 million in the first year alone. But it was when she addressed the company's labor relations issues, speaking with genuine empathy about the workers' concerns, because she had been one of them just days ago, that she won over Patricia Kumar, the board's most influential member. As the vote was called, Elena watched each hand rise in approval, sealing her fate as the new CEO of Sterling Industries. Richard Sterling smiled with satisfaction, but there was something in Margaret Chen's expression that made Elena's blood run cold, a look that suggested she wasn't entirely convinced by the performance. After the meeting, as Eleanor stood in her new office watching the sun set over Manhattan, her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Welcome back to New York, Victoria. We should talk. Someone who knows the truth." The city lights began to twinkle below as Elena realized that her deception had only just begun. She had the title, the office, and the power she had always dreamed of, but with it came dangers she hadn't anticipated. The weight of leadership was one thing, but the weight of living a lie while trying to save a multi-billion-dollar company was something else entirely. As she turned from the window, she caught her reflection in the dark glass and wondered if she was looking at Elena Martinez wearing Victoria Sterling's life, or if Elena Martinez was already beginning to disappear entirely. Chapter 3. 3 weeks into her tenure as CEO, Elena had transformed Sterling Industries' executive floor into a hive of strategic activity that hadn't been seen in years. She arrived each morning at 5:30, before even the most ambitious junior executives, using the quiet hours to study the company's labyrinthine structure and identify the key players who could make or break her initiatives. Her first major decision had been to promote Marcus Thompson, a brilliant but overlooked black executive who had been languishing in middle management despite having developed 3 patents that had saved the company millions. Marcus became her secret weapon, someone whose loyalty she had earned by finally giving him the recognition he deserved. The anonymous text had haunted her, but no follow-up had come, allowing Elena to focus on the immediate crisis facing Sterling Industries. The company's biggest competitor, Apex Corporation, was positioning for a hostile takeover, sensing weakness in the leadership transition. Elena spent her days in back-to-back meetings, her evenings studying every acquisition playbook she could find, and her nights lying awake in the luxury penthouse the company provided, wondering when her carefully constructed world would come crashing down. The apartment itself felt like another costume she wore, its minimalist perfection so far removed from her cluttered studio in Queens that she sometimes forgot where she was when she woke up. It was during a crucial negotiation with Japanese investors that Elena's past life nearly collided with her present. Diane Foster, her former supervisor from the failed startup, was brought in as a consultant by the investor group. Elena's breath caught when Diane walked into the conference room, but the woman's eyes passed over her with no recognition. The expensive clothes, the professional makeup team Margaret had arranged, and most importantly, the total transformation in how Elena carried herself had created a perfect disguise. But Diane's presence rattled her, and for the first time since taking the position, Eleanor stumbled during her presentation. Marcus noticed her distress and smoothly took over, giving Elena a moment to recover. Later, in her office, he approached her with a concern that went beyond professional courtesy. "You know, Miss Sterling, you don't have to carry all of this alone," he said, his voice gentle but direct. "Whatever you're running from, whatever brought you back here after all those years in Europe, you're doing incredible things for this company. The workers on the factory floor are talking about you like you're some kind of savior, the first executive who actually understands their struggles." His words hit closer to home than he could have known. Elena had instituted a series of reforms that seemed revolutionary to the board, but were simply common sense to someone who had lived paycheck to paycheck. She had increased the minimum wage for Sterling's workers, implemented flexible scheduling for parents, and created an emergency fund for employees facing unexpected hardships. These changes had cost the company $10 million, but had already resulted in a 15% increase in productivity and the lowest turnover rate in the company's history. The breakthrough came when Elena discovered irregularities in the company's financial reports, a sophisticated embezzlement scheme that had been bleeding Sterling Industries for years. The trail led to Harrison Wade, the very board member who had first challenged her in that initial meeting. Working with Marcus and a small team of trusted auditors, Elena compiled evidence that showed Wade had been secretly feeding information to Apex Corporation while siphoning funds through shell companies. It was the kind of discovery that required not just access to the books, but the street-smart ability to recognize when numbers didn't match reality, a skill she had honed watching her startup's executives cook the books while laying off workers. The confrontation with Wade happened in Richard Sterling's office, with Patricia Kumar and Thomas Hartley present as witnesses. Elena presented her evidence with the cold efficiency of someone who had nothing left to lose, knowing that Wade could easily expose her own deception in retaliation. But Wade, faced with proof of his embezzlement, had no cards left to play. As security escorted him out, Richard Sterling looked at Elena with something approaching awe. "You've saved this company," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Your parents would be so proud of who you've become, Victoria." That evening, as Eleanor stood in her office preparing for the press conference that would announce Wade's removal and Sterling Industries' new strategic direction, Margaret Chen knocked on her door. The older woman entered carrying 2 glasses of whiskey, offering one to Elena with a knowing smile. "I've been Richard Sterling's assistant for 30 years, Margaret said, her voice carefully neutral. "I know every member of the Sterling family, including Victoria. I met her once when she was 16, before she left for Europe." Elena's hand trembled as she took the glass, waiting for the axe to fall. But Margaret continued, "Whoever you are, you're the best thing that's happened to this company in decades, so I'm going to keep doing my job, which is to protect the CEO of Sterling Industries, regardless of her name." Chapter 4. The revelation of Margaret's knowledge should have terrified Elena, but instead it liberated her. With one person who knew the truth, she could finally drop her guard momentarily, and Margaret became her invaluable advisor, teaching her the intricate social dynamics of New York's business elite while protecting her from situations that might expose her deception. Together, they navigated the aftermath of Wade's arrest, which had sent shockwaves through the industry and positioned Sterling Industries as a company serious about reform and transparency. 6 months into her role, Elena had accomplished more than anyone thought possible. The company's stock had risen 40%, 3 major acquisitions had been successfully completed, and Sterling Industries was featured on the cover of Forbes, with Elena's photograph and the headline, "The Heiress Who Saved an Empire." But success brought scrutiny, and journalists began digging into Victoria Sterling's mysterious years in Europe, forcing Elena and Margaret to craft increasingly elaborate explanations for gaps in the narrative. The crisis came from an unexpected source. The real Victoria Sterling, living under an assumed name in Switzerland, saw the Forbes article in an airport lounge and decided it was time to reclaim her identity. She contacted Richard Sterling directly, arranging a video call that would expose Elena's deception. But fate intervened in the form of Marcus Thompson, who had been conducting his own investigation into irregular trading patterns around Sterling Industries stock. His research revealed that someone in Switzerland had been making massive trades based on insider information, trades that coincided with every major decision Elena had made as CEO. When Elena confronted the evidence, she realized the truth. The real Victoria Sterling had been using her family's company as her personal investment vehicle for years, manipulating markets and destroying livelihoods for profit. The anonymous text hadn't been a threat but a taunt from Victoria herself, who had been watching Elena's every move and profiting from it. Armed with this information, Elena made the boldest decision of her entire charade. She would tell Richard Sterling everything. The meeting took place in Richard's home in the Hamptons on a cold December evening, exactly 1 year after the charity gala that had started everything. Elena sat across from the man who had become a mentor and father figure, Margaret beside her for support, and told him the entire truth. She told him about her poverty, about the borrowed dress, about the misunderstanding that had changed her life. She showed him the evidence of Victoria's insider trading, and she offered her resignation, prepared to face whatever legal consequences awaited her. Richard Sterling listened in silence, his expression unreadable as Eleanor's confession unfolded. When she finished, he stood and walked to the window, looking out at the ocean for so long that Eleanor wondered if he was calling his lawyers. Finally he turned back, and to her amazement, he was smiling through tears. "My brother's daughter, the real Victoria, she inherited his worst qualities, his greed, his callousness, his complete disregard for others. But you, Elena Martinez, you've shown more sterling spirit in 1 year than she has in her entire life. You've saved our workers, our company, our family's legacy. What followed was a legal masterstroke orchestrated by Richard and the board. They exposed Victoria's insider trading to the SEC, resulting in her arrest and the freezing of her assets. Meanwhile, they structured a legal adoption that would make Elena officially part of the Sterling family, not as Victoria, but as herself, Elena Sterling, Richard's adopted daughter and chosen successor. The press release explained that Elena had been brought in initially under an alias to avoid market manipulation, a common practice that, while unusual, was entirely legal. The business world, eager for a story of redemption and renewal, embraced the narrative of the woman who had risen from poverty to save an empire. On the first anniversary of her appointment as CEO, Elena stood before Sterling Industries' annual shareholder meeting, no longer wearing a borrowed dress, but a custom suit she had earned through her own efforts. She spoke about the company's record profits, about the thousands of jobs they had created, about the innovative programs that were transforming the industry. But more than that, she spoke about the power of opportunity, about what happens when talent is given a chance regardless of its origins. As she concluded her speech to thunderous applause, Elena caught sight of herself in the mirror behind the podium. The woman looking back was neither Elena Martinez nor Victoria Sterling, but something entirely new, someone forged in the crucible of deception, but refined by the truth of her capabilities. She had worn an heiress's dress and discovered that leadership isn't inherited through blood, but earned through courage, intelligence, and the willingness to risk everything for the chance to make a difference. The borrowed dress still hung in her office closet, a reminder that sometimes the greatest transformations begin with the smallest acts of desperate hope, and that the most powerful inheritance isn't money or a name, but the opportunity to prove what we're truly capable of becoming.